Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stoliarov II, and I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization. Greetings and welcome to our virtual Enlightenment Salon of February 6th, 2022. Today we will be discussing a subject that is central to the mission of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. It's embodied in our first core ideal in support of significant life extension achieved through the progress of science and technology, and that is the case against death. And before I introduce our guest for today, I would like to also introduce our distinguished panelists. We have our Director of Visual Art, Art Ramon Garcia. We have our Legislative Director, Jason Geringer. We have our Director of Applied Innovation, David Shoemaker. We have our Director of Longevity Outreach, Ben Ballweg. We have our technology advisor and foreign ambassador in Spain, Dr. Jose Cordero. And we have our 2020 vice presidential candidate, Liz Parrish, joining us. So quite a set of luminaries in the realm of advocacy and pursuit of radical life extension. And our guest today is Dr. Ingemar Patrick Linden. This is our first conversation with Patrick after he has published his new book, The Case Against Death. And Patrick really has been pursuing these kinds of fundamental philosophical questions for a long time. He has been on a journey of discovery, taking him from Lund University in Sweden to UCL in London, to University of California, to New York, where he has taught philosophy for almost a decade. He has had a firm conviction throughout his life, since his childhood, as has been the case for me, by the way, that we do not have enough time. And he writes, we are but the beginnings of complete humans, fragments of what we could be. And it was the realization that not all share this view. In fact, surveys show that most do not, that inspired and necessitated the writing of his new book, The Case Against Death. So we're very pleased to host this conversation with Patrick today. Welcome, Patrick, and please tell us more about The Case Against Death, what motivated you to write it, and the key arguments within it.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So, as you explained in the introduction, the feeling that we don't have enough time is something that has been very evident to me ever since I was conscious of thinking about philosophy when I was, 8, 9, or 10 years old. And for a long time, I thought that this was a shared sentiment. But then when I brought it up as an adult, I always heard the same thing, that people were quite pleased that their life wouldn't drag on for too long, and they were afraid that there would be too many people around, overpopulation, all these arguments that we always hear. They came very quickly. That is, very few that I talked to would admit that they wanted more life, that they weren't pleased with the human condition as it is. And I found that when I became aware of that, and also the studies of Pew Research that shows that the majority would not, they say they would not want to take a cure that would give them youth and prolonged life and ability to live to 120 at least. There you have a majority who say, no, I don't think I would take that, but they think other people would, to a much larger extent. I think many of us, when we saw those surveys, we just thought that people are, as Aubrey de Grey puts it, it seems like there's a kind of a pro-death delusion or something like that. And there are many things that are surprising, because at the same time we hear that everyone wants to stay young and live forever, and that life is so incredibly valued and so on. So how do you square that when you actually ask people, and very often in conversations with people, they actually don't seem to be particularly worried about death? Not as worried as I think they should be. I think they should be very worried. So you might think that it has to do with religiosity, but that doesn't explain it all, because when you look at the statistics there, it looks like it's not clearly the case that people who are religious and believe in an afterlife, that they would reject taking a longevity cure. So that it's not so obvious what explains it. So I think part of what's going on, of course, is that people are afraid that there really is no such cure that could prolong their life and their youth. And so they don't want to wish for what they can't have. So you have the sour grapes argument here, that don't wish for what you can't have. And generally, you should accept what you can't change. And that's this kind of a wisdom. So slightly ironically, I label this complex of ideas that justifies aging and death, and says that we must accept it and so on. I call it the wise view, because it has been taught by philosophers, almost all philosophers in the past, that we should accept, that acceptance of death, of aging, is virtuous, that resistance is foolish, that there's a philosopher, Richard Momeyer, who describes the three responses to death: the acceptance, and the denial, and the rebellion, and that the wise people are the ones who accept and just try to learn with it and cope with it. And it's always brought forward as also the kind of psychologically healthy attitude is those who accept and so on. So against that, I'd like to say, if something is unacceptable because it's an evil, then it makes sense to reject it or not accepting it. Why accept it, right? And so I am on the side then of the rebel, right? So if there are three responses, then I think rebellion. And in some sense, it's romantic, because, I'm a bit pessimistic about absolute immortality. I think we can try to live on as long as possible, but I think unless it's a religious or that kind of absolute immortality, it will be difficult to obtain. But to live on in health for longer, that's definitely a goal, far beyond the natural lifespan, right? Okay. So it really kind of upset me that I found myself not living in the same world of values with other people, at least from what they say, or they seem to be sincere when they say they accept it, that they want to live long enough to see their grandchildren grow up, but then they don't want to prolong it anymore. They have a very kind of fixed view. They have the bioconservative view, and it created this kind of philosophical tension that I had to make my case. And so my case is the case against death that came out this Tuesday. So what am I doing in the book? It's a polemic where I go through all the things people say in order to defend the status quo of aging and death, right? So it's the case against death, but in the beginning of the book, I also attack aging, because that too is something that people defend. and they find reasons for saying that aging is fine, and they just want to age in a healthy way, which is something I explain. It's not so easy to separate aging on the one hand and health on the other hand. There are very few signs of aging that are make you healthier in any way. And there's the debate about whether aging is disease or not, or how we should classify it. And I think for philosophical purposes, it's a bit frustrating because, call it what you want. Aging is undermining my health and it kills me. That's enough, I think, to have a science that deals with it. But of course, in the real world, in practical, we all know that it's important that it's labeled or that people get the idea of thinking of it as an illness, because it will facilitate the process of doing something about this. Okay, and then I go chapter by chapter. Then I go over the different categories of arguments, the apologies for death. So I talk about the argument that death is natural, and that if it's natural, then it's good, or we have to have it, or that the individual death is necessary for the health of the system. Those kind of, I call that holist arguments, and I point to troubling aspects of holistic arguments when you compare people to leaves that fall to the ground, and it's okay because the tree is still healthy. And I say it's a kind of step to a political holism there, where you say, cutting off your fingernails doesn't hurt the body, like in 1984 they talk about. And so I defend a kind of individualism where I say it's okay to want as an individual to survive. And this is also a theme I have in the book, that it's the idea of prolonging life is something that's very congruent with an individualism, a liberalism, because very much it's about extending that kind of choice to the most important choice of all, the choice to continue or not continue, and that kind of power. Then I talk about the philosophical arguments that death cannot harm us, because where death is, we are not. That should be familiar to everyone who's done philosophy. It's the Epicurean arguments, also as formulated by Lucretius, and that's an argument that is tricky. The suggestion is that death is like a victimless crime, because you can't find the person who is like suffering from death, because he is no longer, according to the hypothesis. Also, maybe I should also make clear that the case against death is really the case against ceasing to exist. So if death is just a kind of pathway to another existence, I'd like that if the next existence is good. So in some sense, I agree with the religious conception, in the sense that I think they're right when they think that the immortality is desirable, or can be desirable if it happens the right way, if you end up in the right place when you die. It's just I'm skeptical to whether that's actually going to happen. So better safe, better try to extend this life if we don't know what happens next. But in the book, I'm not making any argument against the ideas of the afterlife or anything like that. In fact, I'm sympathetic to that wish for individual survival. And so with that kind of Epicurean argument, that it's hard to find the subject and the timing of death, I say it's tricky. I propose various solutions to that, but I also think that one good line of defense is to take the reductio ad absurdum line and say, what would this actually imply if we think that death can't harm the person who dies? Would that mean that if I kill somebody painlessly, I haven't harmed them, for example? It has several of these implications that just seems to be absurd or not acceptable. So even if it becomes very tricky to answer, I'm sympathetic to Thomas Nagel's line here, that there may be certain harms that you can't really put a subject and a time to. But in the end, I also think, look at what thinking like that death is nothing to us, death can't harm us, look at what that would imply. And I think it's unacceptable. Then I look at arguments from pessimism, that life is overrated, that we should be happy that it's short, and that's the best thing with life. So I talk about, of course, Ecclesiastes, I talk about Schopenhauer, and I talk about the antinatalist, David Benatar. So I'm somewhat of an anti-antinatalist. So in the beginning of my book, I thank my parents for my existence, whereas he forgives his parents for his existence. So I find that a very, very sick view, antinatalism, and I'm very, very strongly against that. I'm very, very. I think we should be very, very appreciative, and I think that although Benatar seems to think that it's consistent to enjoy life and want to continue living, you can also hold that it would have been better never to start. I just don't buy that. I think that if you find life interesting and worthwhile continuing, then it's like you voted with your feet. If you stay here, it's because you think it's not that bad that you came into existence. And if you don't think that, then I don't think it's any. It can be bad for you to want to pass on life either. So that's my view there. And generally, I discuss pessimism. Really, I think there's a lot of pessimism in the world about things, unnecessarily so. And there's a sentiment among a lot of people that this is not a world you want to bring in children to, and you hear things like that. And I think that's very sad. And that's I can see that some of the resistance to our project here of wanting to prolong life will be resisted by people who are imbued with this kind of pessimism. Then I talk about the psychological arguments that we couldn't handle more life, that more life would be boring, and all those arguments. And I say, well, when you look at how we are constituted, what we are motivated by, then I don't think we can see any reason for why we would necessarily be bored. I mean, some people be bored sometimes, but not generally speaking. So I resist that. I say that it's not necessary. It's not something that's deterministic either. It's something that we can deal with, and it's certainly not an argument for wanting to keep the limit as low as it is on our lives. I talk about the deadline arguments, that life is meaningful and valuable because it's short, that it's like a precious metal. If there's a superabundance of life, it would devalue it. And I say that's also not something we need to accept as an argument. In fact, as a very simple argument, if you suffer from a toothache, for example, the fact that you will live for a very, very long time doesn't seem to, make you think that that's any better, or that, well, I can postpone going to the dentist. I'm suffering, I'm in such pain, but since I'm going to live for such a long time, I'm going to procrastinate. And why would you? And the same with pleasure. So I think they got their motivational psychology wrong. I think that as long as we're healthy, we want both stimulation and rest, and there's no reason to think that we would just necessarily stagnate or all that kind of pessimism. So, and I talk about the kind of arguments that the bioconservatives like Leon Kass and Callahan are bringing forth, that says, wishing for more life is wanting more human life, but it is much longer, then it's not a human life anymore. It's not a life for a human, or something like those kind of existential / spiritual arguments. And I also think that they are not very persuasive. I think they're just incredible conservative bias towards what we know, and a real bias towards the bundle we have, and a real failure to see what we could have. That's also arguments that sound very wise again. So again, I'm saying all this is like part of a complex of ideas that presents itself as wisdom, and if you don't buy it, you're not wise, or there's something wrong with you. You need to learn to accept, and a good philosophy is one that teaches you how to accept, etc. And I say, in some sense, perhaps that's going to make you happier, but I think the goal of philosophy is truth. At least primarily. I mean, philosophy can have therapy as a goal as well, perhaps, but there need to be philosophy that is honest and says, well, look, if we just look squarely at death and aging, can we really say that it's consistent with our values to say that it's not bad, or that's nothing to us, or that's not evil? And I say no. And I'm not saying that that's an attitude that's going to make you happy, to be a rebel against death. It's just, to me, it's truthful. It might make you happy because it might spur the progress. I'm not sure it's what makes you the happiest. So it's not that kind of life philosophy. So after that kind of argument, I summarize, and I look at consistent problems that I see with the arguments, and not to mention all of them, but one I see is that there's very often a little bit of a too quick step from showing that absolute immortality, the inability to die or something like that, is bad, to that we shouldn't prolong our lives indefinitely. So they talk about, if you couldn't die, then you could never lay down your life for someone else, and etc. Those things. And well, that might be true, but what's really on the table is some form of contingent, as I see it, some form of contingent immortality, where we will still be able to die. So all of the arguments that sound really wise are directed towards a notion of absolute immortality that's really not on the table, but it's always pretending at, now we knock down contingent immortality, whether that's in biological or non-biological form. But of course, it hasn't touched it. So that's just one. But so I have a list of what I consider to be consistent problems with those kind of arguments, the psychological, spiritual arguments of Leon Kass and Callahan and those kind of writers. And then I move on to the more the social arguments, the overpopulation argument, and other social consequences arguments, justice arguments as well. And so in brief, when it comes to overpopulation, I think, as we already see, the arguments, the places where people live the longest are not the places that grows the fastest. It's the reverse, really. The cultures that has the highest life expectancy are the cultures that, in fact, grows or diminishes even the most. And so that seems to be an exaggerated worry. Perhaps in the extreme, there will be some troubles if life extension, very radical life extension, comes all of a sudden, etc. But most likely we'll have a time period as well to adjust as well. So I don't see that as a. I mean, if you just look at the predictions, the trouble for overpopulation is very local in any case. Most countries are shrinking or not growing very quickly. Most people live in those countries. Other countries, Nigeria and Afghanistan and Egypt and Bangladesh, might have trouble. Absolutely, but it's not related to the fact that they live that long, or so I don't see overpopulation to be, at least in the foreseeable future, as a big problem. And then other social arguments, of course, it's the stagnation argument, the arguments that Fukuyama has been bringing up, and also perhaps Harari and others. I also think that they're exaggerated. I think they are also driven by bias that old people are useless and can't think anymore, and so on. That it's not borne out in the world as it is today, but certainly not when older people have more youthfulness either. So I think it's ageism, and it's not borne out by the data when you look at innovation and Nobel Prize winning discoveries, and all that data seems to show that people are sharp, very high up, and can do great things. And then in the end, I summarize these arguments with a dialogue, because of course that's how we think. When we philosophize, we are arguing with somebody. So I made a kind of summary of the types of discussions I've had with people about this. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Patrick, for this overview. And I'm quite pleased that you have been able to assemble responses to the common arguments against life extension in one place. I think this is the contribution that your book makes, whereas a lot of people in the transhumanist and life extensionist community have provided these kinds of answers. They've tended to be scattered, and for somebody to be introduced to our movement, it's good to have a resource where all of these discussions and responses are contained, so that then people are equipped to address the issue from the multiple angles where it might be discussed in broader society. But I'm curious as to your thoughts regarding what are some of the arguments against life extension that form the greatest mental barriers for people to overcome? Which of these arguments, if they are overcome, would lead the majority of people, or at least many more people than today accept radical life extension, to do so?
First of all, people who are non-philosophers, I think they will react very much to facts that change. For example, if there is a longevity cure available, then they will open up more. If it's really the case that they embrace acceptance because they really don't think they can hope for anything better. But if they can see that they can hope for something better, then that would change their mind, perhaps more than, or it will open their mind for then also accepting more logical reasons or philosophical reasons. The same, I think it's important to have role models or high status individuals who say it's okay to want more life. It's okay to want to be young and healthy rather than old and sick. And so that's kind of the non-logical background that I think is going to do a lot of work. But of course, there needs to be logical reasoning available as well that I'm trying to provide. So what we know, of course, is that people reject this because they're afraid that it's always going to be an exchange between quality and quantity. That wanting a more quantity of life is going to bear a kind of cost. So I think they imagine a prolonged life of fragility and illness and so on. So that's an area that I think if you want to persuade people, to show them that what we're advocating is really that the quantity comes as an effect of increased quality of life, really, that it's the health we give that produces the longevity, and you can't really separate this as it's in people's somewhat pessimistic imagination. So I think that one argument that a lot of people will be in a grip on is that there's something elitist with this, that there will be a kind of this will exacerbate inequalities in the world, that there is a distribution and justice issue, especially from the left, or especially, let's say, the post-liberal left or something. They're very pessimistic. They're very critical towards modernity. They're critical against individualism and so on. And I think that they'll think, well, this is something for Musk and Bezos, and they will perhaps feel resent that they're not going to get access to this. So I think the arguments when it comes to, I think it's very important to be able to calm people on this, and I don't think it will be that easy, perhaps. And I also don't think in reality, I think we probably have to accept that the gap can widen if this technology becomes available, at least at first, before the world catches up. And I think that's something that will create resistance and an argument to work on.
Yes, indeed. And in terms of my own observations as to what the most common objections have been that I have encountered, the first has been the overpopulation argument, though I think the relative preponderance of that is on a declining trajectory as compared to the social inequality argument. And then in third place, I think, is still the boredom argument, though that's competing with the evolution argument, essentially saying that we need a lot of death over the course of many generations in order for the species to evolve and become better. And of course, my response to that is evolution is an extremely slow and cruel process. It doesn't care about the individual at all. So if we think the individual has moral value, it is much better to take charge of our own evolution and try to preserve as many individuals as we can. But in terms of the overpopulation argument, let's address that first, since I do think it's still the most commonplace one. And Jason Geringer in our internal chat has observed that the birth rate tends to go down in countries as a result of economic development and not the other way around. And Jason, feel free to elaborate on your question, but I think you're asking about data that supports this idea of declining birth rates as economies develop.
Yeah, I'm wondering if a lot of people's math is off because they think that the birth rate is going to stay the same, and I'm hoping and that the data will show that the birth rate will actually go down as people become more economically solvent. And I have actually heard the argument one time that it's the other way around, and I don't think it is that way. That that Korea. I shouldn't even repeat this. One time I heard that somebody told me that they socially engineered Korea by going door to door talking to the Koreans, and because they got them to start having less kids, that's why their economic development happened. And I really don't think it's that way. I think it's the other way around. That the economic development happened and then that that made them have less kids. I'm just wondering what you think about all that.
Yeah, I think there are many factors that are collaborating here. I think it's part of it is also the rights of women to be able to make different choices, have career instead of children, urbanization, that it becomes difficult to have a large family if you live in New York, for example, because of space and the cost of space and so on. I think there are a lot of different factors that all collaborate and explain why development goes hand in hand with having fewer children.
Yes, thank you for that response, Patrick. And furthermore, I would like to refer our readers to an essay that Max Moore wrote in 2005, but I think the arguments in that essay remain relevant today. It's titled Super Longevity Without Overpopulation, and he essentially makes the case that even if everybody became immortal tomorrow, which clearly will not happen, the rate of population growth that would result from that would still be lower than the actual population growth during the mid 20th century baby boom. And clearly humankind has dealt with that successfully, and our living standards have risen, our gross domestic product per capita has increased, and many more people, both in relative and absolute terms, have emerged out of poverty in the recent decades as compared to the middle of the 20th century. So clearly, even in the worst case scenario, this is a challenge that we have overcome. Now, I'm curious how you would address this comment by David Wood. He points out there's an argument that the birth rate will go up once menopause can be indefinitely delayed, and when ectogenesis, or synthetic external wombs, become viable. I think in a lot of cases now there is the so-called biological clock, and people feel the pressure to have children within a very narrow time window, often when they're not yet at a point where they're economically or financially ready to support those children, or even emotionally ready. They may think they still have some personal growth and development to do, and that it's unfair to have this very narrow time window. But if, for instance, people can be young indefinitely and they can wait until they're 60 or 80 or 120 to have children, do you think that would materially affect the population trajectory?
Well, there's another recent book by Kay Davis, also at MIT, I think, that he deals with this in more detail than I've seen anyone deal with it. And for him, he says that the important thing is to space out the pregnancy in the right way. And the second solution he has is really a kind of a trade-off, perhaps, accepting limitations on fertility. That if you want a lot of children, then you may have to also forgo some radical life extension, that it becomes a choice. In some sense, it would be very fair to the bioconservatives to say you can have your old cycle.
Interesting.
But I mean, yeah.
We had a virtual Enlightenment Salon with John K. Davis, who is also a philosopher, and he also debunked a lot of the common arguments against life extension. But in his view, the concerns about future population growth are some of the most persuasive, but he still thinks we should give this phenomenon some time to develop before any sorts of restrictions on population or restrictions on individual choice might be justified, because there are scenarios in which this situation would essentially resolve itself, and there would be some sustainable approaches going forward. So, for instance, John H. in our chat writes that population pressures sound like a decent argument for space exploration and colonization, and there are also other realms that humans could develop into, like colonizing the ocean floor or the surface of the oceans with seasteading. And we have a lot of land as well that is undeveloped on Earth. So there are still many ways to accommodate a growing population without restricting individual choice. Now, we would also like to thank John H. for his generous super chat. Thank you very much. And we always appreciate your contributions to the discussion. I wanted to also bring up the conversation about antinatalism, because I agree the idea that it's somehow not desirable to have children as a moral consideration is not one that I share. On the other hand, there may be a kind of set of practical considerations, as you discussed, why people might choose not to have children or choose to delay having children. One such consideration could even be that right now humankind still has not overcome aging and death. So if one does bring a child into this world, then that child is also going to go through what we all went through, which is to learn about human mortality and recognize the initial injustice of it. This is the subject of my illustrated children's book, Death is Wrong. And part of that book goes through my personal story about how I learned at a very young age that people die. And my initial reaction was, this is a terrible injustice and I need to fight it. But for a lot of kids, after they experience that sense of injustice, that frustration, they're gradually cajoled into accepting death by the mainstream culture. And it is worrisome that this cycle of new generations growing up with death acceptance would continue as long as we don't have the scientific advances to defeat death. So what would be a good response to this in terms of perhaps both overcoming antinatalism and creating a situation where future generations of children don't have to go through this terrible realization that their mortality is not that far away unless something dramatic changes for the better?
I'm not sure about the question.
So essentially, do you think it's a good reason right now, for instance, to say it's justified to be reluctant to have children until we solve these problems? Or is there some way in which the cultural environment can be changed that children of generations that would be born in the fairly near-term future don't experience the same cycle of being outraged that death exists, but then being comforted into accepting death?
Well, I'm not so optimistic when it comes to succeeding eliminating death altogether. I mean, I think it will always be on the table. I mean, like you take away death from aging, but you have so many other causes of death, of course. So I think children will continue to be aware and then deal with it. But it is a very interesting question. I thought that maybe I should think more about it. But at one point we're honest and we say we don't like this situation. It's actually completely unacceptable. It's terrible. Here we spend time building connections with other humans, and then they are taken away from us in this completely gratuitous way. It is an incredible, cruel human condition we find ourselves in, if we're being honest. And then the next is, okay, how much time should we spend ruminating on that? And should we perhaps find structures where we both recognize that we are against this, but we do find ourselves in it, and we try to make the best of it in some way. I mean, I know that there are certain transhumanists who try to go in a more constructive route that's maybe even somewhat religious almost, in order to kind of deal with it in a both honest and constructive way. But I don't have anything really to contribute, perhaps, to that at this point.
Well, one question that I would have that I think you could make a contribution in is, what do you think would be the most persuasive arguments for children to not fall into death acceptance? Because I think it is a lot easier if somebody as a child, like you and I were, does not accept death and doesn't get persuaded to accept death, to then, as an adult, become an effective advocate for extending lifespans, as compared to someone who does accept death for a long time, and then he or she has to do a lot of work to get to the point of realizing some of these problems with death acceptance. So what do you think would be the arguments that work best for children, and that would be easiest to spread in the culture for people at early ages, even if they have other influences that push them toward death acceptance?
I mean, it looks like, I haven't read your book, but it looks like you were telling a kind of counter narrative in your book, and that looks like the kind of arguments we would need. But as we know, oddly enough, I mean, the big narratives are found everywhere, where acceptance is taught to be virtuous, and there's nothing more evil than want to live, especially wanting to live beyond your natural limits, like Voldemort, for example, or the White Witch, or the Darth Vader, who wants to, in some sense, prevent the death of his loved. And so, I mean, all the most wicked characters are people who are pro-life, in our sense of being pro-life. And so, of course, I think, creating counter narratives, perhaps along the lines of what you've done, and Bostrom's piece, the fable of the dragon tyrant.
Yes.
And also movies, perhaps. It's because still, if you go to a movie, the villain is going to want eternal life, and the hero is going to sacrifice himself, or in some way show that that's where the limit goes.
Yes.
I recently saw Doctor Strange. I don't know if you've seen that. There is that he learns all magic. He can bend space and time, but he's not allowed to live that much longer. That's the taboo. That's where the line goes.
Yes, indeed. I think we do need a lot more of these counter narratives, because there are so many death acceptance narratives interspersed throughout popular culture and fiction. And we have way too many science fiction dystopias as well. We need to balance them out, at least, with more techno-optimistic visions that also have the correct philosophical insights about the desirability of longer life. I want to give the floor to Jose Cordero, because he has a question.
Yes, thank you very much. And Patrick, I want to congratulate you for an excellent book and a great presentation, and to have it published by my alma mater, MIT. I am an engineer from MIT, where there is also a very good Department of Philosophy, so congratulations. I have two quick remarks, and then two quick questions. The two quick remarks is that one of the arguments that is also very common, I think, is the one about dictators, that what happened if dictators would never die, and so also to add that to the list of Gennady. And about overpopulation, I think this is a non-issue. This is false, and we have to rejected from upfront immediately. I think it's just the opposite. The population of the world is stabilizing and it is declining. And this is a tragedy. We need more people. We need more people. People not only come with a mouth to eat and with a behind to excrete, we come with a brain. The brain is the most complex structure in the known universe.
Yeah.
That is why humanity has advanced so much in the last 2 centuries, because we have lots of more people. When Malthus said that there were too many people, actually, London barely had 1 million people, and England less than 10 million people, and the planet less than 1 billion people. And he said it was the end of the world. It was the end of the world because we had few people and we had little technology. Now we have lots of technology and lots of people, but the problem, the people are beginning to stabilize the population and then decline. So I think we have to be upfront. We need more people, not less people. We need more brains. We need more creativity, imagination, and so on and so forth. Anyway, those were my comments. Yeah. Now my questions. I live in Madrid, and there are many people who are very religious, and they actually say that they want to die to see Jesus, God, the creator, and all of this. And it gives them peace of mind. And, you cannot argue when people are dying and they want to be peaceful. That is their hope. Also, I lived 3 years in Japan, and I traveled a lot in East Asia, where there are other cultures, other traditions, as you know, other religions. Like, for example, in Buddhism, you are supposed to overcome all the anxiety, all the suffering of humanity, and therefore death is a release, is an escape of this suffering in the world. So they die peacefully, or they try to die peacefully in some East Asian countries. So that is my question. I cannot argue with someone who is dying because they want to be peaceful with their death, because death was unavoidable until now. In the future, we will be able to avoid it, but they want to be peaceful. So what do you do? How do you convince them that death is wrong?
Yeah, but I mean, if they're old and dying, I wouldn't even try. I mean, then they have other priorities. Perhaps they want to live happily. It's a little bit about this idea. There are two ideas about philosophy. One is that it should be therapeutic. It should help people be happy, live a happy life. The other one is that it also aims very strictly at truth. And I think sometimes for some people, this will be a tension that they're not going to be able to bridge that. I mean, it's not easy to both know what we know and also to remain calm. But I mean, I don't think we should be calm. I think we should be upset and try to change the situation. We should be rebels. But it's not for everyone to be a rebel, I think. And it is difficult. It is difficult. In some sense, I recommend that at some moment in your life, be honest and say, I'm not going to stand in the way of this progress. I'm going to do what I can to fight death. But then perhaps in another frame of mind, believe what you need to believe. Perhaps. I mean, I think people are very different. I mean, we are philosophers. For us, I think truth is paramount, and we believe what we think is right. And if it's tragic, it's tragic.
Yes, I absolutely agree with that outlook. I do think truth is more important than achieving a particular emotional state. In the words of Dylan Thomas, do not go gently into that good night, rage against the dying of the light. And that's all that Dylan Thomas could do, and that's all that a lot of people up to our present era could do. But still, even if death were inevitable, it would still be evil. and it would still be justified to recognize it as evil. Jason, you wanted to say something as well?
Yeah, one thing, I don't really look at it like it's rebel, though. I look at it like just following the science. I mean, it's if the science is there and we can do it, well, then that's what we're going to do, you know? And as far as like the kids, you know, if I would have learned in science class that there's this possibility that, you know, we're coming up with some science, well, then that's what I would have believed, you know, but they told me in science class that it would be impossible. So, you know, that's, I think there's a lot of people that just don't believe it, you know, because the science is not, well, most people don't pay attention. But that's where you think that this would be amazing story, you know?
Yes, indeed. And along these lines, Aubrey de Grey has stated in recent years that we may be a few years away from an inflection point in societal attitudes where a lot of people will suddenly start perceiving the possibility of radical life extension as being on the horizon. And he thinks this shift will occur before the medical breakthroughs even become available for that, but people will start to expect the breakthroughs and advocate for them. Do you also share this fairly optimistic anticipation of the future that Aubrey has articulated, or do you think even once it becomes practical to reverse biological aging, there would still be a lot of cultural resistance that will not accept the new reality so readily?
No, I think the resistance would in large measure melt away once it becomes feasible, once it becomes possible. That's what I think. I think a lot of it is still what we call the sour grapes phenomenon, or you don't want life to be tragic. And so if you don't think you can do anything about aging and death, then you might as well accept it, because otherwise you live in a world where you say, well, things are really, really bad in this way, and that's just how it is. And I think a lot of people don't want to bear that kind of tragedy, so they find different means to escape it. But I think once there's some hope, some real hope, people really believe that this could work, a lot of resistance would melt away, I think. That is once they have the pill in front of them and it's a simple fix for youth and longevity and so on, I think a lot of the arguments would seem would quickly just seem quaint, the kind of really bioconservative arguments.
Yes, and I think it's similar to how bioconservative arguments in prior eras seem odd to us now, like the argument against train travel, that human bodies were not meant to travel at speeds faster than a horse, or arguments against anesthesia, that God meant for humans to suffer pain, or arguments against open heart surgery as playing God. Those do seem rather quaint, even though religiosity has not really diminished overall. The majority of people still consider themselves to be religious. And indeed, we've had comments in the chat from our friend Sergei Gubkin, who mentions that essentially religious people and people who believe in some sort of spiritual existence, like people of New Age persuasions, still form the majority of the population. And the issue is they don't believe that death is real in the sense of the cessation of the individual, even if we do nothing, because the basis of a lot of religions is this inability to accept the possibility of one's own non-existence. And it's a very intuitive thought pattern. Because you can't really imagine yourself not existing at all. Nothing in human experience really compares to it. Sleep or amnesia don't compare to a complete loss of vantage point upon reality. So a lot of people think, oh, surely there has to be something after this material life. Surely there has to be something that survives the body. And indeed, when I publicized Death is Wrong back in 2014, there were some interesting responses from fundamentalist Christians who were saying comments like, yes, we agree with him that death is wrong and death is a terrible tragedy. However, he's going about it the wrong way and trusting in science and technology, and really he should just trust in Jesus completely, and that's how one gets to eternal life. Of course, I don't think that's what can cause life extension in the least, but how would you respond to people who will say, well, we like the idea that death is wrong. We do think death is a tragedy, but we think we get eternal life through our religious beliefs, so we don't have to bother with science and technology. How would you respond to them?
I would say my biggest quarrel is with people who are naturalists who still accept that death, because I see myself friendly to those who believe that it's desirable and that there's a possibility of an afterlife. Two things. Interestingly, in the Pew surveys that I referred to earlier from 2013, there wasn't this big difference between the religious and not religious when it came to this wanting life extension. So perhaps there won't be that kind of resistance from the religious community that logically you might expect. So my theory there might be that these are just people who, like us, are really into life and wanting to live and individual survival. Of course, it's very hard. It's very hard to. I mean, you would have to find arguments that would. I mean, you're not going to have them abandon their religious outlook. So you would have to argue within their frame of reference. So you could say, if you had more time, you had more time to perfect yourself and become ready for the next dimension or what they believe in, for example. Or if you're appreciative of this great gift, then it makes sense to want to keep it and not to throw it away so easily, or something like that. I don't know. What do you think? I mean, it's not in some sense I made an effort not to get into discussion of the possibility of the afterlife or anything like that, because it just that's a whole book in itself. It's
yes,
yeah.
And I agree that compatibility that is possible between religious framework extension or transhumanism. Indeed, we had a virtual Enlightenment salons with Micah Redding of the Christian Transhumanist Association and Carl Youngblood of the Mormon Transhumanist Association, and we discussed that at length. I think ultimately religions are lagging indicators of societal, cultural, technological realities, and eventually they do evolve and adapt, and there are some interpretations of religion that are more forward-looking than others and that may be of assistance to us. For instance, the Christian transhumanists and the Mormon transhumanists who do try to emphasize the compatibility of their religious views with radical life extension. And I would also say that there are aspects of certain religions' theologies that are helpful to us here as well. For example, the Mormons don't have a problem with playing God. They think that humans should try to become more like God, and that includes using technology to expand human capabilities. And likewise, in Christianity, there has historically been a certain valuation of the individual and an emphasis on the importance of the life of the individual and also of doing good works. So one could communicate to Christians in the following way. If you believe life is sacred, then more life would be better. If you believe doing good works is virtuous, then you would have more time to do good works, irrespective of what you think about whether there's an afterlife or not. So I definitely think there are areas of common ground that can be found. I do think the greatest source of resistance among both religious people and non-religious people is status quo bias, the inability to imagine a future that is dramatically different from the present, even though change happens all around us and the pace of change is accelerating. Now, I'm curious how you would respond to this question from David Wood. He writes, does the hostile passion of the anti-vax community against treatments that would improve their health suggest that similar anti-pro-longevity communities will arise and oppose longevity therapies? So do you think that this recent phenomenon is something for us to be concerned about with regard to how large segments of the population are receiving emerging medical treatments, how they're responding to them, how they may not be as accepting of them as we would have hoped?
Well, to the extent that the anti-vaxxers are objecting to what they conceive as the forced nature of things, then yes, I think people would want to reject what they would conceive as being forced or quasi-forced or somewhat forced upon them. Radical life extension, if it was forced upon them. Yeah.
Yes, and I think that's a good answer.
Yeah, perhaps, but also I think the bioconservatives and the religious perhaps are going to be less of a problem than what I said before when it comes to the kind of post-liberal left or the critics of Enlightenment, for example, who are very skeptical to Western science and who just sees this as a very elitist project, and those sentiments might actually become a problem. I'm not sure. What do you think? Yeah.
I agree with you. I think, of course, given that this series of conversations is called the Virtual Enlightenment Salon, you know where I stand and where we in the Transhumanist Party stand in terms of this divide. And indeed, the Enlightenment legacy has so thoroughly penetrated a lot of areas of Western civilization that many people, both religious and secular, have come to accept it. And a lot of the contemporary religious denominations have certain Enlightenment era influences that enable them to at least engage in discourse with us, whereas I don't have that same view for what I would call the postmodern left, the people who criticize the very foundations of Western civilization or scientific rationality. And whereas, say, even 7 or 8 years ago, I would have said these people are confined to academia, essentially, and their mode of thinking is not adaptive to the broader world. We have unfortunately seen, especially in the wake of this pandemic, when a lot of people have experienced strain financially, psychologically, in terms of their physical safety and health, they are tempted to question and challenge the foundations of a society that they think has failed them in some way. And so they find it tempting to resort to a lot of these postmodern anti-Enlightenment arguments, because I think it arises out of a desire to replace a system they think has failed with something else. Of course, my solution would be to reinvigorate the sense of meaning within Western civilization that has been lost precisely because of these kinds of postmodern critiques. But this sense of meaning can be found precisely in the fight against death, disease, decay, ruin, in a kind of renewed confidence that through science and technology and rationality, we can overcome these problems. So that would be my solution, and trying to persuade as many people as possible of the merits of that solution. But I acknowledge there can be a lot of resistance along the way. And this post-liberal left, as you point out, has become increasingly vehement and vicious sometimes in how it deals with people who disagree with it. And I haven't found that on the religious right at all. That is to say, even the fundamentalist critics of transhumanism will generally just write articles like, well, they should have faith in Jesus instead of science and technology, whereas on the post-liberal left, they will try to shut down anyone who disagrees with them.
And there's also very sad anti-humanism that's cultivated, and I heard just recently about the virus that said, no, it's humans are the virus. The virus is the solution. You know, this kind of anti-human sentiment that I think is just terrible. I have a very exalted view of humans. I think a world without human, like Schopenhauer, he dreams of a crystalline state where there's no biological life forms that can suffer, like on the moon, and that's exactly what the antinatalists are talking about as well. I find this. There is something in the culture that is incredibly sad that young people, these ideas that they get that somehow humans are an infestation or something like that. I get the students writing essays about, you know, how much better the world would be without humans and things like that. I mean, it's just it's an incredible waste of energy and this kind of pessimism and anti-humanism that I think is also taken as a kind of, you know, world-weary wisdom or something, declinist acceptance of a declinist narrative.
Yes, indeed. It is quite tragic. Jose, you wanted to comment on this?
Yes, absolutely. That makes me also very upset. It irritates me when I see young people saying, this is the end of the world. We have too many people. There are no resources. And I think this is horrible. We are living in the best time in human history, the best time ever. However, the future will be even better thanks to humans. Again, we have the brain. The brain is the most complex structure in the known universe. This is a marvel of nature. So maybe tomorrow we will find some Martians, and the Martians will have bigger brains. But until that time, you know, our brains are at the top of the chain. And even though we have mouths and we have behinds, you know, we create, we innovate. We are the ones who have made the world advance so much, and now we are going into space. We live in fascinating times. So it breaks my heart when I see, especially some young people in some places, to look at the future with a negative sense, when we have to be proud of what we have done and what we will do in the future. And again, we need more people, not less people, more brains, more creativity, more imagination, more dreams.
Yes, I completely agree with you, Jose. And also, I wanted to point out David Wood's thought in response to Patrick's comments. He agrees that we shouldn't give any impression that people will in any way be forced to take rejuvenation therapies. And indeed, nobody in our movement wants to force people to do anything. We believe in autonomy and morphological freedom and individual choice. As Patrick has said, this is fundamentally an individualist outlook. So I think there are people who may be worried for whatever reason. I think they've been misinformed that this would be some sort of mandated immortality, but really we can't mandate that people take medical treatments today. People have the right to refuse medical care if they so wish, and we're not planning to take that right away by any means. Jason, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, first and foremost, we're about morphological freedom and individual freedom. So that's by ensuring the freedom for others, you ensure your own freedom to not change if you don't want to. It, you know, so it ensures your ability. That's it. Go ahead.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. And I wanted also to open this up to other questions from the panel. So let's go to Art Ramon.
Yeah, in the vastness of space, the human lifespan is just insignificant. And I think we could definitely use that as an argument to promote longevity, is that, hey, there's plenty of room to expand. And, probably the first ones to receive longevity treatment would be like Space Force soldiers and captains who go out exploring. They'll probably benefit first, and they will be, really great role models to other people. It's like, but of course you'll have those pessimistic people who say, well, we're just that virus that's spreading to other planets. I think if ever there's inequalities where it's difficult for lower income people to get it at first, maybe they could volunteer to go colonize, Mars. That would be an incentive, in order to receive longevity treatment and have that long lifespan.
Yes, absolutely. I concur with those comments, Art Ramon. And indeed, it seems that a lot of the objection that we have encountered in recent years especially has come from those individuals who fear the inequitable distribution of access to these treatments. And sometimes they'll point to the costs in the existing medical system as being barriers. And I think they have some empirical evidence to support their case. So Mike Lazine writes that some people don't get medical care because they cannot afford it. Sometimes it is an issue of cost rather than just not wanting it. So there are people who might want to live radically longer and improve their health and overcome dreadful diseases. There is concern about how quickly they would be able to afford it, given that medical care is a major area of cost. And unfortunately, in some areas of medical care, the costs keep rising. And Patrick, I wonder what you think about this response. My response typically has been that where technological innovation is sufficiently free and it's not constrained by a lot of restrictions and a lot of bureaucracy, the cost tends to come down on its own as new competitors enter the field, as new insights are learned about how to effectively manufacture and distribute treatments. And eventually these technologies become very affordable. In some cases, like email, for instance, they become essentially free of charge to individuals. So would that be your response as well to people who are concerned about the cost of medical care and the affordability of life-extending treatments?
Yeah, but I will also add that we can imagine different scenarios. It depends on what the radical life extension procedure entails. We don't know yet. It could be something that's not very expensive to produce. And then, of course, what makes certain medicines so expensive is the development, the research, and so on, together with the fact that perhaps not that many people need them. But this is, of course, a drug that potentially billions of people need. So you got the scale that it could pay back for research very, very quickly. And it could be, if it's scalable in its production, if it doesn't involve any incredibly rare material, or if we can't reproduce it artificially and synthetically. But I don't think that would be the case. So I think that the fact that there are so many immediate users, billions already. Then I thought about the financing. I think if it's very expensive still, but it's expensive like a house, then you can imagine mortgages. So if you can't pay for it up front, you get so many more years that you can make money and pay back. And I mean, you can imagine many more socialist nations like Sweden could just assume that enough of the population wants it and pay for it that way, and say, well, we also get a healthier population that works more, pays more taxes, and that way pay for it in a communal way. And it depends on what kind of culture you have or what kind of political system of distribution you have. I can see that there can be different models for different societies as well, a more libertarian model as well. So
Yes.
I think very much it's like people throw their hands up and say, well, this is a knockdown argument against this project, instead of thinking, well, of course there'll be a lot of methods that we haven't even thought of yet, and even just quickly thinking about it, and you can think, well, if it's like a car, people who are not very rich can still afford a car because they pay it off in installments, or a house or something like that.
Yes, and these are quite good points. Thank you, Patrick, because yes, people have found ways to pay for large goods that they find to be sufficiently valuable, even if they do not have resources immediately on hand. And living longer in good health is the precondition to the pursuit of all other values. And if somebody were to give me a choice of, for instance, taking out a mortgage for $1 million or dying, you know which one I would choose, because I could earn the $1 million over time. Even if I had to pay a lot of interest on that debt, I would still prefer living to dying. And I think a lot of people would be in that position. But Aubrey de Grey has also pointed out the economic argument for governments to support life extension treatments, because if one can delay the onset of age-induced ill health, then that would save a lot of money for the pension system. That would save a lot of money for systems like Medicare or the National Health Service in the UK, or a lot of other government subsidized or government managed healthcare systems. And as a result, the net cost savings would be substantial. Now, I wonder what you think of this comment by Zach Richardson, who writes, a health-giving pill would never be rejected, but some kind of surgery to install an upgraded organ into your system would likely receive sharp rejection. Do you agree with that? Do you think that if people see the surgery as risky, and David is showing his shirt with an upgraded organ there, do you think for the majority of people this would be seen as a barrier, or if the surgery were sufficiently safe and effective and people could see others who emerge from that surgery and are healthy and happy and live longer, that they would over time come to accept that as a routine procedure?
Yeah, I think it could be accepted as a routine procedure. And just like today, when there are long lines waiting for these kind of different operations. And yeah.
Yes, indeed. So now, David, since you showed us your cyborg shirt, what questions or comments do you have for Patrick?
Okay, Patrick, no cyborg questions, okay? I want to ask maybe a more fundamental question, at least in my thought. We've talked a lot today about people changing their minds about radical life extension. But what I'm thinking about is science, which science, health, technology, that's certainly part of the Transhumanist Party. Science is probably better than anything else I've seen as far as being able to adapt over time. There can be problems getting new theories in, but eventually science adapts, moves on, accepts new theories. Those eventually influence people. But I'm wondering about philosophy. So from a philosopher's point of view, how do philosophers think about change? And is there a school of philosophy that that's integral to? Like, we think this now, but we think that perhaps going to the future things could change, or something along that line. I'm just curious because there could be allies for the radical life extension community if that exists in philosophy like it does in science.
Well, there's of course, as you know, the people in Oxford, Bostrom and Peirce and philosophers like that.
Yeah, that's a very good point, because they write books. I see them online. That really helps. And that's specifically in these areas that we're talking about. But what about change in general, as far as philosophy is concerned?
I'm not sure. I'd have to think about that.
All right. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, and of course we've had 2 virtual Enlightenment salons with David Pierce, and we'd be happy to have Nick Bostrom as a guest someday, as well as someone like Max Tegmark or Anders Sandberg. All of them are, I would say, great allies to our movement, and they would agree with the fundamental case. Yes, of course, Nick Bostrom is the author of The Fable of the Dragon Tyrant, which is still the most effective fiction in favor of radical life extension by far. There's an animated video of The Fable of the Dragon Tyrant that has garnered millions of page views, and that's an example of a very effective conduit for these kinds of ideas. Now, I wanted also to give Ben Ballweg, our Director of Longevity Outreach, the opportunity to ask a question and or make a comment. And in particular, Ben, how do you think listening to Patrick's overview as well as his responses to some common questions, common objections, should shape the way we pursue longevity outreach? Ben, I think you need to unmute.
Thank you. I'm going to have to come back to your question, Gennady, but I do have my question for Patrick. Any written work that was particularly enjoyable for you to refute, or at least to keep in mind while writing the case against death?
Yeah, well, I think the Bioconservative, Leon Kass, for example, his book Life, Liberty, and the Defense of Dignity in 2002 provided a good kind of foil for the psychological arguments of that we need death as a deadline for aspiration and ambition, and that there would be kind of unspeakable tedium, and that to wish for more life is to wish to no longer be human, and all of those kind of existential arguments as well. I found it very useful, because he and also Michael Sandel, from perhaps a little bit different, more left-wing, but also a bioconservative point of view, his case against perfection I found interesting, because both Kass and Sandel, they are very aware that our liberal society that they decry is all kind of justifying the choice of living on and the development of the technology to enable that free choice, because it flows from autonomy, individual rights, welfarism as well, and there's not very much to stop it. Of course, they are bioconservatives, so they want to stop this impulse. But what I liked about them was also that they kind of recognized that the logic of a lot of our commitments as liberals in a liberal democracy points towards expanding this choice.
Yes, indeed. And it seems to me that the logical extrapolation of the Enlightenment project as well is radical life extension and transhumanism, improving the human condition through science and technology. It's just that in the 18th century, the Enlightenment philosophers didn't have access to the same level of technology that we do, though some of the most forward-thinking among them, including the Marquis de Condorcet and Benjamin Franklin, anticipated some of these technological advancements. So it is true in my view, that a lot of the premises underpinning the Enlightenment liberal society of today, the society that embraces individual rights, the value of individual life, rationality, the scientific method, efforts to improve the human condition, to overcome suffering, to overcome the problems in our world, all of those currents of thought point directly toward fighting death and expanding human lifespans. It's just a matter of getting people to accept that consistently and overcoming the barriers within their minds, and of course the resistance from those who reject the Enlightenment. Now, there's also an interesting question from David Wood. He writes, of all the arguments in favor of what you call the wise view, which personally strike you as the most compelling, that is, as being less wrong than the other arguments? And I think this is a useful question to consider, because those might be some of the last arguments left standing, even if we do make major technological breakthroughs that enable people to live radically longer.
Well, so I think philosophically, I think the missing victim arguments, or the Epicurean arguments, were the most difficult to deal with. The fact that where death is, you are not, and where you are, death is not. So when is death afflicting you, or when are you suffering from being there, on the assumption that death is the end? So of course you have a strong, we have a strong feeling there's something wrong there, but I found it quite difficult to pin that down. So philosophically speaking, I thought that old Epicurean argument was quite difficult. So of course, as I said before, the way I think is probably best to deal with is to show what it would imply to accept that death is nothing to us. And I think it has, as I explained before, I think it has unacceptable implications. Otherwise, I think the argument that Fukuyama, for example, brings up, that now we kind of share this human predicament, but if there is a period where all of a sudden a group of humans take off and live in a completely different human predicament, that could in some sense break apart something that might also break apart society, and those kind of arguments that we would no longer share the same basic conditions of what we regard as life. If somebody can expect to live to 1,000, or a group of people can accept to live to 1,000. So again, I think those are the argument, and that I said before. I think the idea, the distribution problem, or what people conceive of as problems with increased inequality and all that bundle, I think is something we need to address people's worries about. Mm-hmm. So those two kind of arguments. The philosophically difficult was probably the Epicurean argument, but I think otherwise the other argument that we are separating ourselves into different classes of people when we have kind of a democracy that assumes that we are similar.
Yes, very interesting. And David also writes that he thought your treatment of the missing victim in your book was excellent, where you highlighted the unacceptable consequences of that view. So even though you think that's a more compelling argument than most, you've still done good work in showing its errors. And I would also say, for me, as an individualist, the concept of total non-existence is a lot more frightening and unacceptable than even the concept of a hell. That is to say, if there were evidence for a hell, I would actually prefer that to ceasing to exist as an individual, because there are still at least vestiges of a personality, of the experience of time, of the experience of some sort of being, even if it's in terrible suffering. Whereas non-existence just means everything is gone, including everything that was ever good in one's own life. So that is my outlook on it. And of course, on the subject of different classes of people, I do think a powerful counter to that would be the existence of socioeconomic mobility. And as long as we can facilitate that through technological change and through rational policies that help improve access to these technologies instead of creating rigid barriers, then any sort of differences of this sort would be very short term in nature. Now, I also want to turn the floor over to Ben, since he tells me he has had time to think about longevity outreach and how to incorporate Patrick's ideas into it.
I don't know if I have quite from Patrick's ideas, but I guess I've been feeling like that we I like in our Facebook groups and in Discord, we are very much talking internally and trying to figure out how to bring these ideas outside these circles in ways that don't scare people that may never have heard of these possibilities before. I don't know if you have any insights to share specifically in that way, Patrick. I mean, sure, if you publish a book and promote it, what other ways are there to let people know that we are starting to tiptoe into realms of possibility that could be longer lives for all?
Yeah. No, I think popular media, films, television series, books, and counter narratives that we talked about before, when all the big narratives are all apologists, they're all making excuses for death, and then to have something that is death rebellion, those kind of narratives, to get them out there, to get a hero who wants to live on, and have the villains trying to stop him, for example.
Yes, that is an excellent idea. And I would encourage anybody to create those kinds of narratives through fiction, through art, through interactive media like computer games. And along these lines, this year I'm planning an update to Death is Wrong. Death is Wrong was written and published in late 2013, and we've had more than 8 years of progress as well as societal change during the interim. So I'm curious, Patrick, if you think about the past 8 years and both the scientific advances that have been made, as well as changes to everyday life or people's perceptions of life, what would you suggest ought to be in this kind of book, especially aimed at a young audience? And I would say by young, I don't just mean children who learn about death for the first time. I also mean teenagers, people whom Jose talked about, who may be more culturally pessimistic than is warranted by their age. So what do you think would help in terms of the messaging and the content of such a book aimed at that audience?
Well, you need to create an attractive hero who's a prolongivist. Just like it's to get figures that are high status and attractive to come out being prolongivist. I think that would make an enormous difference.
Like Brad
Yes,
Pitt.
indeed.
Get him on board. It would be pretty sold pretty quickly, I think. Him.
Well, there have been.
I'm just kidding.
There have been efforts to reach out to certain celebrities. For instance, DJ Steve Aoki is a longevity proponent, and so is Edward James Olmos. Both of them have made essentially videos for the SENS Research Foundation in past years. And we have our friend Maria Intrigus Abramson to thank for that, because she had prior connections with these celebrities and they were quite sympathetic to the life extension message. We discussed this in our virtual Enlightenment Salon with her in February of 2021. But thank you for those insights, Patrick. And I agree, we should have a compelling narrative with a compelling hero. Zach Richardson, our director of publication, also points out we do have an attempt in the works to restore a tablet game that was released in an alpha version in 2014 called LEV, which stands for Longevity Escape Velocity, where one plays the role of a character who tries to live to the age of 200 and make various decisions regarding health and how to use one's time along the way. And I actually have a lot of the resources for that game, but I don't have the final alpha version. So I've been trying to reconstruct it. I've been able to reconstruct it conceptually as a turn-based game that could be played with some Excel spreadsheets, but programming it into a game that could actually be played on a PC or a tablet, that's an entire different order of magnitude of effort. But I definitely hope that we could make that happen as well. So I also wanted to bring up another question from David Wood. I think his questions have been quite insightful today. And David noted, he did read your book, that you have certain reservations about other aspects of the transhumanist project, while you're in agreement with the transhumanist views on super longevity. You have some reservations about goals like improving mental well-being and moral character. And what might change your mind about those goals as well?
Well, so one of my fears is that messing with the economy of beliefs and values, and also assuming that we know the right balance, and I think the risk that something goes very awry is quite large.
And
there might be what we consider to be biases that are built into us for a reason. I sound like a bioconservative now, I know, but it might be that we get rid of things that might seem irrational from our point of view, but really have a certain kind of rationality.
That reminds me of the argument made by Friedrich Hayek, the Austrian economist and philosopher, about rejecting certain traditions that might not make sense at first glance because they might have evolved to fulfill some useful role in society or facilitate a larger emergent order that humans don't understand. But of course, on the other hand, there are many traditions that have outlived their usefulness. And if one were to overcome them, there might be a period of discomfort or some sort of transition cost, like shifting from the English system of measurements to the metric system. And interestingly enough, there are some countries that were able to make that shift successfully, but the United States did not. There might be a similar period of transition. But on the other hand, we do see a lot of damage being done by human cognitive biases or irrational emotions, particularly tribalist types of emotions and attachments that have led to hyperpolarization and partisanship, which I would consider to be our greatest obstacle in terms of public acceptance, because we are not seen as part of either the red tribe or the blue tribe, and both tribes have an attitude of you're with us or against us. So if you are skeptical about the use of technology and modifying the human brain essentially to overcome these problems, which I understand will not happen right away. It would take decades of time to reach that level of understanding and mastery. But what would your recommendations be, either in the meantime or going forward indefinitely, to keep these very harmful tendencies in check? What techniques that don't involve brain modification would you recommend?
Well, I wanted also in my book to isolate this case so that people don't have to accept all of the ambitions of transhumanism and so on, but let's talk about prolonging life first. So I'm not sure I have sufficiently developed views on that. I mean, my hesitancy is this, like you said, Hayek's information problem. Do we think we can go in and design something better a priori with certain principles? Would some philosophers say we should be more utilitarian, for example, and then we get the problem that philosophers argue that if you're utilitarian, you should be Kantian, or if you're a utilitarian, you should make people more Kantian, or more, and so on. It becomes very complicated. I think that, and as you said, of course, there are instincts and that are leading to terrible things, but I think it'll be difficult to sort that out and fine tune it, and who does it, and there are different views on this as well, maybe fundamental value views, and I can see that it's quite I mean, it might be worth it. It might be another risk worth taking, and it might be a solution to overcoming what might completely undo us if we don't get over certain biases we have and so on. But I think I would need to think more about this to say something interesting.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I do appreciate your comments on this issue nonetheless. And Zach Richardson wants to know what you think about Neuralink and whether you would consider getting one. If so, what level of safety would you need to adopt its use, and what utility do you think that would provide?
It's also nothing I think that much about. I guess I want to continue the kind of life I'm familiar with mostly, but of course, yes, to be able to improve your memory, to have the recall, to have deeper appreciation of things, and so on. It all depends on if it works well and so on. I'm not completely against anything like that. We will see.
Yes. And fair enough, I'm not lining up for a Neuralink myself at this time. I think the technology is way too invasive and experimental to be tried on someone as risk-averse as myself at this stage. David Wood points out that Chesterton's fence is the argument against deciding that a fence in the countryside seems to have no purpose and therefore can be removed. It was first published in 1929 by G.K. Chesterton, and Chesterton, of course, is known to be a very thoughtful, philosophically sophisticated conservative. David continues in saying, yes, there are risks with trying to redesign the human mind, just as there are risks with trying to redesign the human body. So we shouldn't rush into either project, but they're both worth exploring. So thank you to David Wood for those comments. And now, David Shoemaker, you mentioned light bulbs in our internal chat. So would you care to elaborate upon that?
Well, it's more of a whimsical comment. You were talking about the things like changing to the metric system and resistance from that. And I remember the insane amount of objection to installing light bulbs that ran cooler and cheaper, clearly in everyone's best interest. And there was still an objection for that. So that gave rise to another thought, though, so I'm glad you asked, because it seems like change, if it's slow enough, people can absorb and they can accept it. I'm thinking that where human lifespan used to be 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, 60 years, and so on, as we extend healthy years gradually, I've not seen any demonstrations in the street claiming that we shouldn't live, longer, and we've clearly greatly improved that. So I think that will continue. I think that's perhaps a sense of optimism that I can carry forward. Maybe when people start routinely going over 120 years, maybe that'll be a bit of a speed bump. But even then, I think it will probably work out well as well. Probably much better than the quick adaptation of light bulbs, I think.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you for those observations, David. And indeed, I think people are more inclined to accept gradual change because they can adapt to it, because they can figure out ways to still function well according to their interpretations of what that might be in the new reality. On the other hand, I want the change to be rapid enough to come in time for me and also for the people in this conversation and for you, David, because I don't want to be the first person to receive these treatments when they're still experimental. I want to be part of the second or third generation to receive these treatments when they've been refined and improved. So we do.
I wholly support your argument.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we do have a sense of urgency, and I think it would be interesting to know we have 3.5 minutes left in our broadcast. Patrick, what do you see as the best case scenario for the successful struggle against aging and death? And what do you see as perhaps a less optimistic scenario? And how would you compare the two in terms of their probability? Which do you think is more likely? Are we going to make it to longevity escape velocity in our lifetimes?
Ooh, I sure hope so, but I also hope that my parents will make it, who are in their 70s and 80s. I can't really say. I really hope so. It's something interesting that you said, that you're trying to communicate in your book for children, and this is this kind of horror of realizing non-existence. And I think a thing that's a bit surprising is that in my classes, I've only had a handful of students who really hated the idea of not existing anymore, and that's very interesting. But that's a side point. So I just wonder what is it about our psychology that we have such a kind of strong awareness of this, and it's less common perhaps than we think. Well, so the positive scenario is that we get escape velocity on this, and it looks like the money is starting to flow towards this, and I see a lot of promising signs. We have David Sinclair and his success with his books, and I see, and I'm very optimistic that, for example, the economic argument, I don't think, unless it becomes a very expensive thing, it can be sold so easily to say, look, part of a success story in terms of wealth is that people live longer. That has been part of the whole explanation. And so if you're worried about economy and healthcare and so on, we need to keep people healthier long. I think it's just I think we're going to win the argument quite quickly once the science is there.
Yes, thank you very much for those comments, Patrick. And hopefully you are correct. Hopefully the progress of the science will help us win the public arguments, including the philosophical arguments as well as the practical arguments that are sometimes being waged. I also want to thank Alan Crowley for his generous super chat. And he also says that since he is older than I am, he will want to have the experimental version of the radical life extension treatments soon. Hopefully we can get that in time for Alan and everyone else in this session. We've had an excellent conversation. We have about a minute remaining. So Patrick, I would like to give you the last word. Any final insights that you would want to share with us today?
Well, I've been very inspired by you, and I'm very happy that there are people out there sharing this understanding and trying to do something practical about it. So I want to thank you for the opportunity to talk about my book, and I strongly support what you're doing.
Thank you very much, Patrick. And we strongly support what you're doing as well. Everyone, please purchase a copy of The Case Against Death, make it an Amazon bestseller, and spread the insights in it, the counters to common arguments against longevity, so that we can improve our culture and we can make sure that all of us will get to live long and prosper.
Yes.